Okay, well, welcome to our Torah class for 2019. Let me say, I think I'd like to open with a word of prayer. Well, Father God, thank you. Thank you for your Torah. Thank you for a group of people that likes to meet together on Tuesday night and study your Torah. And I ask that you just continue to inhabit your word and teach us. Teach us the things that you need us to know, that you'd like us to know, and teach us to learn to listen and to do. Bless our conversation this evening. In Yahushua's name, amen. Okay, so I guess since this is the first of the year, I ought to do just a little bit of recapping. We did not do broadcast the past 2 Tuesdays because the first Tuesday was Christmas Day, and the second Tuesday was New Year's Day, both of which we don't particularly observe, but we took a democratic vote, and we decided that we'd meet anyway and study, and well, actually we did something special. We had a movie that we watched, and it was a long movie. It was about 3 hours, so we broke it up into those 2 weeks, those 2 Tuesdays, and the movie was Joseph. It was a good movie. I think most people liked it. It had, it had all the essential parts of the story, I thought. And I remember the first time I saw it many, many years ago, I was amazed at how much I learned from it. It made me go back to the stories in Genesis and read them and see they didn't really do that. And sure enough, they did, and so it was kind of useful from that sense. And we had a good time doing that. But anyway, so if you missed us online for the past 2 weeks, that's the reason, because we're not allowed to broadcast that stuff on YouTube because it's copyrighted movie. So that's what we did. Anyway, we are studying the Torah. There's a prescribed method of studying it. Actually, it was around in Yeshua's time that they had divided the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, up into portions. They divided it up into 54 portions, and each week you could study a portion. And if you did that on a specific schedule, everybody, all practicing at that time Jews who did this, would go the same schedule. They started right after Sukkot, which is like October-ish, and they would go 1 portion per week, more or less, and they would finish. And so they could do the whole Torah. They'd start at Genesis 1 and go through the whole Torah and finish at the end of Deuteronomy in a year. And many of us had done that. And one of the things you find when you do that is there's a lot of moving right along because the discussions get going and there's a lot of material to cover in 1 week. So we took a vote and we decided that what we would like to do is just move through the Torah at our own pace, so that whenever we didn't finish one of the portions, we didn't feel like we needed to rush ahead. We could just pick up where we left off, and that's what we've been doing. So it turns out that before we took the 2-week break this last couple of weeks, we're in Exodus now, and we had gotten to the 9th plague. The 9th plague is at the end of chapter 10 in Exodus, and if I remember right, and this is not getting any easier as I get older, but the 9th plague was darkness, plague of darkness, and we talked about different experiences that we'd had where people had been in such total darkness, you couldn't see the hand in front of your face, and how it was a pretty scary kind of feeling. But anyway, that's where we are. And so, let's see, I guess I'd like to ask, are there any questions or any comments before we get started? Otherwise, what we do is we read a passage, usually a fairly good-sized chunk, and then we talk about it. I have books that some people use to study the Torah with, and they're useful in that they go right along with the text, and so you read a little portion, and there's questions in there, and the questions are meant to make you think. A lot of times we read the Bible, and it's become, for me anyway, it's kind of become familiar, and so you kind of read through it, or at least I do, and I kind of, oh yeah, I know what that says. I've been there. I've said this. I've read this 100 times. But whenever you go back and ask yourself some obvious questions, it's amazing how you find out you didn't really get it. So that's part of what this is to make sure we really get it. And the other thing that I found after looking at the Torah, I guess this has got to be about the, 17th or 18th time I've been through it. every single time I learned something new. And almost every week I learn something new. And it's the discussion that you guys provide that makes that happen. And I'm convinced that God inhabits these discussions because we're here because we want to learn. You know, we want to learn about Him, we want to learn about His Torah, and we want to know Him better. And so I think He honors that by saying, okay, here. You know, and so like I say, we can all benefit from this. I needed to do all of that, and I feel better now. Any thoughts or comments, or we'll just go on? We'll just move on. Okay, so we're going to start in Exodus chapter 11. Exodus chapter 11. My little, they have, some Bibles have kind of little subject titles about what this is about. And mine says, the plague on the firstborn. It's the 10th plague. Chapter 11 in Exodus is the 10th plague. And the way we usually do this is we get someone to read chapter 11. It turns out it's kind of short. So if someone would like to read chapter 11, then we'll talk about it. And so somebody can raise their hand. Let's see, I think Matthew's got the mic.
No, I'm...
You didn't want to read? You were just wanting to make sure somebody had it. Okay, I can read it.
And Yahuwah said to Moshe, I am bringing yet one more plague on Pharaoh and on Mitzrayim. After that, he is going to let you go from here. When he lets you go, he shall drive you out from here altogether. Speak now in the hearing of the people, and let every man ask from his neighbor, and every woman from her neighbor, objects of silver and objects of gold. And Yahuwah gave the people favor in the eyes of the Mitzrites, and the man Moshe was very great in the land of Mitzrayim, in the eyes of Pharaoh's servants, and in the eyes of the people. And Moshe said, Thus said Yahuwah, about midnight I am going out into the midst of Mitzrayim, and all the firstborn in the land of Mitzrayim shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne, even to the firstborn of the female servant who is behind the handmill, and all the firstborn of cattle. And there shall be a great cry throughout all the land of Mitzrayim, such as has never been or ever shall be again. But against any of the children of Israel no dog shall move its tongue, against man or against beast, so that you know that Yahuwah makes distinction between Mitzrayim and Yisrael. And all these servants of yours shall come down to me and bow down to me, saying, Get out, you and all the people at your feet. And after that I shall go out. And he went out from Pharaoh in great displeasure. But Yahweh said to Moshe, Pharaoh is not going to listen to you in order to multiply my wonders in the land of Mitzrayim. And Moshe and Aaron did all these wonders before Pharaoh. However, Yahweh strengthened the heart of Pharaoh, and he did not let the children of Israel go out of his land.
Okay, so like I say, we'll just ask some simple questions. So, how does God indicate to Moses that this is going to be the last plague? Beg your pardon? He tells him. He says, then the first part, he says, in the first verse of chapter 11, he says, I will bring one more plague on Pharaoh and on Egypt, and after that, he will let you go from there. So he that's some of these questions are not too hard. He tells them so, right? What special instruction does he give the people? It says also right there in verse 2, tell the people that men and women alike are to ask their neighbors for articles in silver and gold. And it says that, in parentheses, says, Yahweh had made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, and Moses himself was highly regarded in Egypt by Pharaoh's officials and by all the people. So let's talk about this for a minute. Why do you suppose, why do you suppose people were inclined to want to do this? Well, first of all, had we heard this before? Is this the first time you ever heard this? Where did we hear this before? If you go back and you read early in the book of Exodus when Moses is having his first conversation with God at the burning bush, God tells him that when you leave Egypt, the people of Egypt are going to give you gold and silver and clothing for you to take with you. And he said his words, maybe they come here, and in this way you shall plunder Egypt. Okay? Can you think of any other reasons why this might happen? One of them kind of gives you a hint there in this parenthetical thing where it says, God had made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, and Moses himself was highly regarded. So in other words, if you had been going through these 9 plagues and been watching what's going on in Egypt, to say nothing of the drama that was going on between God and Moses on the one side and Egypt and his magicians on the other side, and you were just kind of an average Joe Egyptian, you might begin to wonder, well, I wonder if I'm backing the right team here. So there's that. I can think of another reason too why the people might be inclined to want to do this. Yeah. Yeah. He's saying, okay, look, we want you to get out of here. So if giving you some gold and silver makes it all that much more likely that you'll get out of here, go here, take some. I read another one today that I thought was kind of interesting. I hadn't thought about this. It was the Hebrews, the Israelites, were slaves in this particular instance. And God was essentially, freeing them. He was giving them their freedom. And it was common in the culture of the time, if a slave owner gave a slave his freedom, he oftentimes gave them parting gifts to say, you've been a good slave, you've got your freedom now, here, take this. And it's usually of some value. I mean, you could even think of it so far as like the 30-year watch you get when you leave some company after a long time or something like that. Anyway, so they were doing it also in a sense of honor, I guess. Anyway, I thought all of that's very interesting. Okay. So what does Moses, or what's the essence of the 10th plague? What's going to happen? I mean, God, through Moses, is pretty good about telling Pharaoh what's going to happen. Now, the advantage of telling him what's going to happen is that then when it happens, there's no doubt that God did it. It's not like forecasting the weather. Who was it? Someone said, here in Phoenix, if you forecast the weather, it's going to be warm and sunny tomorrow. Heck, you're almost a prophet because it's almost always warm and sunny tomorrow, right? You're wrong every now and then, but not real often. So, but God was careful typically to tell Pharaoh, this is what I'm going to do. And then he did that. So this is yet another time that he says, this is what I'm going to do. So this is what I'm going to do? He says in verse 4, this is what Yahweh says, about midnight I will go throughout Egypt, and every firstborn son in Egypt will die, from the firstborn son of Pharaoh who sits on the throne to the firstborn son of the slave girl who is at her handmill, and the firstborn of cattle as well. There will be loud wailing throughout Egypt, worse than there has ever been before or ever will be again. But among the Israelites not a dog will bark, or any man or animal. Then you will know that Yahweh makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. All these officials of yours will come to me, bowing down before me and saying, go, you and all the people who follow you. And after that, I will leave. And then Moses left. So Moses has told him all along exactly what was going to happen, But then God says to Moses, he'll still refuse. He'll still, he still won't. You can tell him that if you want to, but he's not going to do it. One of the questions that I have in my little study Bible that I thought was kind of interesting is, why do you suppose, if we was going to come to this, and God knew it was going to come to this, why did he go through these first 9 plagues? He could have just gone through right to the 10th one and been over with it, and the whole thing would have been a whole lot shorter. So what are some of the reasons that he did that? Mark?
I'll answer your question, then I have
comment.
something to say.
Okay.
This goes back to something I've been pointing out over the last couple of months, several times, that God says whenever it's time to gather the scattered seed of the 10 tribes, he says, I'm going to prove myself holy amongst the nations that you're in through you. Well, notice he's using the Israelites here to show himself holy in the midst of the Egyptians. So this is one of the ways he shows who he is. And then not only does he show who he is, but he shows that he can make a distinction between this and that. He can make a distinction between times of the day and all kinds of things. You know, he says here he's going through at midnight. Well, that's I've heard it say when the bridegroom comes, it's about this midnight time, in the middle of the night. And then I like this midnight term here because there are people that say, no, the Israelites left while it was still dark. They did not leave while it was daylight. Well, I got news for you. If the whole thing began at midnight, I doubt much of it ended before 4 a.m. anyway. I mean, this is a lot going on here from midnight to whatever time, you got wailing going on probably, I would guess at least to 4, maybe even all the way to sunrise or beyond.
Yeah.
So the time of the day here, or the time of the cycle is very interesting. And, so the other word I wanted to point out was in verse 1, it says, he will drive you out from here completely. And the word drive is the same word that's used for a husband expelling his wife. It's this yagaresh. It's the root for garage, how like Abraham drives Hagar away and that kind of thing. So this drive you out, it's that same kind of wording.
Yeah, that's a good point. As before, there was all kinds of jockeying around that Pharaoh was doing. He was saying, okay, look, your men can go, but your women have to stay here. Or your men and women can go, but the cattle have to stay here. Or why don't you just have your festival right here? He had all these little things that he was adding to the party. And the reason, according to some of the stuff that my notes in the Bible here said, that they both knew that what was at stake here was Pharaoh's captive workforce. He didn't want to lose them. I mean, they were valuable to him. They were building, I like to think they were building the pyramids, but I don't know what they were doing. They were a free workforce. And what God was telling Pharaoh to do, let my people go, was basically they will give them their freedom. They will no longer be slaves to you. They're leaving you. And this is the main reason they think, or some people think, that Pharaoh was, one of the reasons he was so obstinate was that he didn't want to lose these. He didn't want to lose the workforce. And that goes along with the drive out, because he'd been coming to all these different kind of mealy-mouthed compromises. You can do part of this, or you can take part of the people, but all of them were designed so that they weren't really totally leaving, permanently leaving. And in here, when he drives them out, they're leaving. That's the
This is probably why we'll see this in Revelation. It talks about the plagues coming back. The purpose of the plagues here in Exodus, as I had pointed out, is going to be this used for the same purposes at the end.
Yep. And so that's a good question. What are some of the purposes of the plagues? We've had some talks about this. What are some of the purposes of those plagues that we've seen? The first 9, actually all 10 plagues. We got to let somebody else answer it.
I think, some of the purposes is that Yahweh is in control.
It's showing he's a more powerful God than the gods of Egypt.
Yeah.
We talked about how each plague is basically a slap in the face to some Egyptian god. Yeah.
And I think also it's to show that Yahweh is patient.
Fair point. That's a good point.
That, there's numerous, especially in the Psalm that talks about Yahweh's being patient,
Yeah.
long suffering.
Yep.
Possibly they needed all 10, because if it had only been one, they hadn't been following Yahweh and weren't familiar with him. This was a way that they could be introduced to him over a period of time that they needed to be also convinced not to turn around and run back.
Yep. And then when you say they, actually, as you were talking, I believe you were probably talking about the Israelites, but it worked for both of them. You know, by seeing this same lesson kind of over and over and over again, they obviously had to wake up and smell the roses, so to speak. And then another one, of course, was what Mark had brought up. Beginning, I think, as the third plague or the fourth plague, he told Pharaoh, I'm going to bring this plague on you, but the Israelites won't be affected by it whatsoever. And that way you will know, and everybody else, that the Israelites are my people, and the Egyptians and you aren't. So that was another thing, is to make sure that he was showing a distinction. Yes?
So we've talked in previous classes also about how each plague has something to do with an Egyptian deity.
Yep.
So he's showing the Egyptians basically how useless their gods are, and that he is the one true God.
Yep, that's right. So that's all of that kind of that's why he had to go through 10 plagues, if you will.
And not to mention the fact that by right, God has access to the first of everything. So that includes the firstborn, and it's I think it's also much of a demonstration to the people of God saying, hey, the first is mine.
Yeah.
And later on in Joshua, the Israelites had that same lesson with Jericho. The first city being
Jericho.
Yeah.
That's good. We're going to go on with that idea here in a minute, because it comes up in this next chapter as well. So, let's see. We're in chapter 12, unless there's any other comments. So the essence, Margaret has something. The essence of this particular plague was every family in Egypt was going to lose their firstborn son, right? Whether they be Pharaoh or everybody was. That's all we know so far at the end of chapter 11. Chapter 12, we'll find out how the Israelites, we'll read more about that. But anyway, that's the plague, is that firstborn sons are going to be killed. Margaret.
I found it, verse 7 here, kind of interesting that it talks about that not a dog will bark, not a dog shall move his tongue against man or beast.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah,
it seems like you could. I don't know, but in my neighborhood, if somebody walks outside, one little yappy dog starts barking, the others come out and bark too.
Isn't that the truth?
And it's it seems like even the dogs weren't barking in
Israel.
Goshen.
Or in Israel. Yeah, in Goshen. Yeah. That's a good point.
So that's a kind of a silence that would be awe-inspiring, I think.
I think so too. Well, this is a good time to ask this question. Why do you suppose, let's see, what has happened in our story so far, well, in Exodus so far, that would make this a kind of a fitting punishment for Pharaoh and the Egyptians?
Because his firstborn would rule after him.
Well, yes, that's a good question. I mean, that's a good answer. I was looking for something a little more. It may not be quite that profound. Yeah.
Yeah, I think as a parent, they can attack you, but don't attack your children.
Well, there's that too.
Yeah,
I'll give you both of those.
It's like, okay, Yahweh is taking care of the children.
Yeah. He's going to. Yeah. There's also, like Matthew was saying, there's something special about the firstborn son. That's also a big deal. But on a more just, common sense level, what was the thing that went on back when Moses was a baby? You remember? Pharaoh had passed this edict that all the Egyptian slaves, if they had a male baby, they were to throw it in the Nile. Right? So he did this. He said that it's not only firstborn, he says, we're going to kill all your sons. As a son is born, throw in the Nile. He was afraid that the Hebrews would become too numerous and strong for them. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
So in some sense, this fits that. Oh, you like that idea? God says, okay, I can do that.
Kind of evening the score here.
Yeah. I mean, it's not a big important point, but it's just something to think about. Yeah. Okay, well, let's go on. If there's no other thing, we'll go on to chapter 12. Now, chapter 12 is a little long. Someone want to read the first 13 verses of chapter 12?
And Yahweh said to Moses and to Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, This month shall be the head of the months for you. It shall be the first of the months of the year for you. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, On the 10th of this month they shall each take for themselves an animal of the flock for a father's house, a flock animal for a house. And if the house is too small for a flock animal, he and his neighbor next to his house shall take according to the number of souls, each one according to the mouth of his eating. You shall count concerning the flock animal. A flock animal, a male without blemish, a yearling, shall be to you. You shall take from the sheep or from the goats, and it shall be for you to keep until the 14th day of this month. And all the assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it between the evenings. And they shall take from the blood and put it on the two side doorposts and on the upper doorpost, on the houses in which they eat it. And they shall eat the flesh in this night, roasted with fire, and they shall eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Do not eat it raw or at all boiled in water, but roasted with fire, its head with its legs and with its inward parts. And you shall not leave any of it until morning, and you shall burn with fire that left from it until morning. And you shall eat it this way, with your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in awe. It is the Passover to Yahweh. And I will pass through in the land of Egypt in this night, and I will strike every firstborn in the land of Egypt, from man even to livestock, and I will execute judgments on all the Elohai of Egypt. I am Yahweh. And the blood shall be a sign to you on the houses where you are, and I will see the blood, and I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be on you to destroy, when I strike in the land of Egypt.
Thanks. That's just great. Okay, some of the simple questions. So when is this going to happen? What does God tell the Israelites that they're supposed to do based on what's about to happen? This month, he says, shall be the beginning of months for you. This is the start of your year. Okay? Now, in the Israelite culture, it was really easy to tell when a month starts. You didn't need a John Deere calendar on your wall. All you needed was looking at the moon, right? And when the moon wasn't visible because it was a new moon, that was the first of the month. And so the first of the month was always obvious. Furthermore, the middle of the month, the 15th, if you will, was always pretty obvious because that was the full moon. So there's a lot of advantages to having a solar-lunar calendar, which is what the Israelites had. We don't have that. The Roman calendar is just a solar calendar. And so we have to figure out when the months end, right? But they didn't have to. They could just look up and see when the months end. So he says, this month is to be, he calls it the head of months. Does anybody know what, let's see. Well, the term Rosh Hashanah, Rosh is the head. Hashanah is the year. So Rosh Hashanah is the head of the year. That's the new year. But it turns out it's not this month. But go ahead.
This is so explicit according to how it's all celebrated now.
Mm-hmm.
Calling the Feast of Trumpets the Rosh Hashanah,
Mm-hmm. Oh,
Babylonian thinking.
yes. Oh, yeah. Well, I was going to go on.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Are you finished? or no?
Whereas the word is actually Rosh here is for the beginning, and
Yeah.
then it says the first month of the year too.
Yeah.
So it's pretty explicit.
It's very explicit.
It's very plain.
Very explicit. And the original name of this month was Abib or Aviv,
Yeah.
which is literally spring. Okay? So it's the first month, it's the spring. So it's what it amounts to is it's the first new moon after the spring equinox. That's when the first of the year is. Yeah.
So just to point out what I think I mentioned this the other day. So that as you're pointing out, it's the word beginning here is Rosh, and the word month is Chodesh.
Mm-hmm.
It isn't moon, because you'll never see moon associated with Chodesh. Chodesh just only means month.
Okay. Okay. But the month is what they use to determine the moon is what they use to determine the month.
You said it correctly when you said solar lunar.
Yes.
It isn't just the moon. It's,
No.
It's
Okay.
and this is where the people that observe a lunar calendar, they've
off.
left out the solar
Yeah.
part of it.
Yeah.
And so there's other parts to it than what is being done in some circles.
Yeah. Well, one of the things, if you sit there and kind of study the calendar and reflect on it a while, you realize that the one that's described in the Bible is got a lot of advantages. One of the things that I've always been excited about is that, like I say, I've often, when I was younger, I asked my questions, how do you know what day it is if you don't have a calendar? You know, and if you lose track, oh my gosh, what happens then? You know? And like I say, the God's method there's no problem with that, because you can tell when the equinoxes are by just putting a stick in the ground and watch when the sun comes up and goes down. You know, you can do that. And you can tell what the moon does just by looking. You know, so all of these things are just entirely visible. And so, I don't know, I liked it. There was another point here I was going to make that I thought was interesting too, is that it's the month of Aviv. It's the month of spring. So he's saying the new moon in the spring is the first of the month for you, is the first month of the year for you. Now, how did that ever get changed to Nisan? Because that's what this month, you know, if you ask somebody when's Passover, they'll say, well, it's on the 15th of Nisan. Any thoughts about that? I wouldn't expect you to know. Mark knows, but he cheats.
No, I was just going to say, you talked about Abib, spring, which is, I think, the right way to determine the meaning of the name, because the city that they call Tel Aviv, Aviv is Abib. Okay? So we ask any Israelite, what does Tel Aviv mean? They say it's the spring mountain.
Yeah, Spring Hill. Spring Hill, so it is. Yeah, absolutely. The answer to my own question was why did it get changed to Nisan is I think it's a testament to the insidious nature of the adversary. When long after this, when the kingdom split apart and the northern kingdom was dispersed and the Babylonians conquered the southern kingdom and hauled them off to Babylon to live for 70 years in captivity, they took the Torah with them, and they had these scholars that sat there and studied, and they renamed the months, and they did stuff. They kind of got creative. All the months of the Hebrew calendar that they use today in civilly are typically Babylonian gods. Just like, Janus is January, and then all that stuff. The days of the weeks and the months of the year on almost every calendar in the world are names of pagan gods, which is kind of shame. But anyway, that's where that comes from. So, moving right along, I get to go too slow on this. Let's see. So, what did God ask of the Israelites to avoid having to suffer the same plague that the Egyptians were going to suffer? Very specific. Take your version said, excuse me, a flock animal. I got a kick out of that because a flock animal is either a sheep or a goat. And it says that. It's either a sheep or a goat. Most people think of the Passover lamb, and I guess that may be because most most Egyptians had lambs. I don't know. But it could be either a lamb or a goat. It's a flock animal. And what other specifications of this animal? How old did it have to be? 1 year. Turns out that a 1-year-old lamb is pretty nearly full grown. So it's not a teeny animal. It's a good sized animal, you know. And what was the other? What other things did it say here about? Beg your pardon? Had to be perfect. So no 3-legged animals or ones with, you know, blind or anything like that. They had to be a perfect.
Spot or blemish.
No spot or blemish. And then how was it to be prepared? Roasted. It was not boiled. I get a kick out of these kind of details because I don't know what God's got in mind, but he was very explicit. You know, don't get creative here and make lamb stew. And no, it's not lamb stew, it's roasted. And then what happens if if it's just you and your wife? And a lamb will feed a lot of people. What are you supposed to do?
Let it burn till the evening or the morning.
If you have leftovers, you're to burn them. That's true. But if there's just a couple of people and a couple of people can't consume an entire lamb, you're to get together with neighbor. And it says very explicitly, make sure that the lamb you have is sufficient for the number of people that eat with you. So in other words, get together and do it properly. Don't waste the food, but don't make everybody have just a bite, you know. That's all very interesting to me. Then he even talks about how you're to eat it. How are you to eat it? Well, you're to roast it for sure. You're to eat it with bread made without yeast and bitter herbs. Yep. And then you're to stand and have let's say, I think your loins girded, whatever that means. Mine says here, which is probably the same thing, says you're to eat it with your cloak tucked into your belt. Okay? And your sandals on your feet and your staff in your hand. And mine says eat it in haste. Yours had a different word than haste. I liked it better, but I don't remember what it was. Eat it. I'm in verse 11. The end of verse 11. What does it say?
And you shall eat it in awe.
In awe. Awe is different than haste, if you ask me. But that's the nice thing about different versions, is because awe might be a better word, really. In other words, do this reverently. You know, it's not supposed to be some lighthearted. That's the impression I get anyway. And then, what are you? So obviously, the big deal is what are you supposed to do with the blood when you kill the lamb?
That would be putting it over the doorposts of your house.
Mm-hmm. And then, what does God say about that? What's He going to do?
Pass over
okay. Yeah.
the house.
The Hebrew name for the holiday is Pesach. Pesach does not mean Passover. Pesach means Pesach. Okay. Passover is the English word that was invented to point or to mean this holiday. So it's the English word Passover that was invented to describe this word. It wasn't the fact that Pesach. Let's see. Another way to put it is I'm making this up, but I'm pretty darn sure that if you're the things that you use whenever you're on the highway and you drive over a railroad track, that's nowhere near the word Pesach. It's not a Passover, So there's Pesach is intended to name this holiday. It's not intended to mean Passover. Passover was the word in English that they used to identify Pesach. The only reason I say that is because Passover is kind of I always thought, where did that word come from? It says right here where it came from, right? I'll see the blood on the doorpost and I'll pass over. That's where it came from. So it's a perfectly good name. I don't know. I just found that interesting. Any other thoughts about that? It seems like a kind of a strange ritual, doesn't it? Seems kind of weird to me. Yeah.
I'm interested to see that it says, when I see the blood. So somebody can think, I don't want that messy stuff on my house. I'll just put a little tiny.
Good point. Yeah. Well, there's one of the questions we often get to at this point is, do you suppose there were any Israelites that didn't do it? Probably.
Yeah.
Do you suppose there are any Egyptians that did?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's kind of a neat thing to think about. Okay, I guess we'll talk more about what this thing really does as we move along. Does somebody want to read from verse 14? Oh, I don't know. 14 through 30.
"14. And this day shall be unto you for a memorial, and you shall keep it a feast to Yahweh throughout your generations. You shall keep it a feast by an ordinance forever. 7 days shall you eat unleavened bread. Even the first day you shall put away leaven out of your houses. For whosoever eats unleavened bread from the first day until the seventh day, that soul shall be cut off from Israel. And in the first day there shall be a holy convocation. And in the seventh day there shall be a holy convocation to you. No manner of work shall be done in them, save that which every man must eat. That only may be done of you. And you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread. For in this selfsame day have I brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe that this day in your generations by an ordinance forever. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at even, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at even. 7 days shall there be no leaven found in your houses. For whosoever eats that which is leavened, even that soul shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether it be a stranger or born in the land. You shall eat nothing leavened. In all your habitations shall you eat unleavened bread. Then Moses called for all the elders of Israel and said unto them, Draw out and take you a lamb according to your families, and kill the Passover. And you shall take a bunch of hyssop and dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and strike the lintel and the 2 side posts with the blood that is in the basin. And none of you shall go out at the door of his house until the morning. For Yahweh will pass through to smite the Egyptians. And when he sees the blood upon the lintel and the 2 side posts, Yahweh will pass over the door and will not suffer the destroyer to come into your houses to smite you. And you shall observe this thing for an ordinance to thee and to thy sons forever. And it shall come to pass when you be come to the land which Yahweh will give you according to as he has promised, that you shall keep this service. And it shall come to pass, when your children shall say unto you, What mean ye by this service? That you shall say, It is a sacrifice of Yahweh's Passover, who passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt, when he smote the Egyptians, and delivered our houses. And the people bowed the head and worshiped. And the children of Israel went away and did as Yahweh had commanded Moses and Aaron. So they did. And it came to pass that at midnight Yahweh smote all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, and the firstborn of Pharaoh that sat in his throne, unto the firstborn of the captive that was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of cattle. And Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants, and all the Egyptians. And there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where there was not one dead.
Okay. So there's plenty to talk about here. So this is, okay, there's a couple of things. Let me just do it this way. this thing describes, well, he says you're supposed to commemorate this. You're supposed to do this in the future, right? And you're to celebrate it each year. It's a lasting ordinance. And then he describes this companion feast that goes along with it. I forgot to ask, but when was this lamb supposed to be dispatched, if you will, offered, sacrificed?
I believe that's day 4.
Well, it's the 14th. It says between the evenings, which is commonly known as twilight. So it's twilight on the 14th of Aviv is when you sacrifice the lamb. And then it goes on to say, for 7 days you are to eat bread made without yeast. So there's the feasts of God are 7. And they're grouped 3 in a group, and then 1 kind of by itself, and then 3 more in a group. And so these are the first 3. We haven't talked about the third one, but the first one is Passover. It's what we're talking about here. But then this next one talks about, for 7 days you are to eat bread made without yeast. That's called the companion feast, and that's called the Feast of Unleavened Bread, intelligently enough. So what goes along with that feast? What's the object of the game there? What do? You eat bread without leaven in it. And we'll talk about leaven here in a minute. You're supposed to hold a sacred assembly on the first day. That is, right after you've celebrated the Passover meal, in the future, that's a day of rest. And then you eat, go around and kind of about your business for the next 6 days, but you eat no unleavened bread, no leavened bread that entire time. And then the 7th day, you have another feast in which that's the end of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So the Feast of Unleavened Bread lasts a week. Seems kind of strange, too. This whole thing's a little bit strange. What do you suppose? Let's talk about leaven for a minute. There's lots of things that we can kind of get from this. I mean, we're going to talk back up here in a minute and talk about the whole idea, but what's with the leaven? Anybody have thoughts about that? Why he says unleavened bread?
Well, it has to do with the haste that they had to move and do stuff with.
Yep. The idea with Jan makes challah a lot, and she always piddles around and makes stuff, and then she puts the yeast in there and kneads it, and then she sets it somewhere, kind of like on top of a stove or something that's warm, and it rises. And if you didn't do that, it'd be unleavened, right?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little challenging because you take different scripture, where you have in the New Testament, you have or maybe it's I forget if it's Proverbs or not, but where it talks about the kingdom of God is likened unto a leaven in a loaf of bread.
Yep.
How it spreads.
Yep.
But then we go back to the leaven of the Pharisees.
Yep.
Which is a bad thing, I think.
Yep.
We go back to the leaven, the unleavened bread, thinking it's a good thing that it's not leavened, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, but then you have this other verse, so it's kind of one of those paradoxes, where it's used as a good thing for talking about the kingdom of heaven, but then over here it's not.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I find it confusing. One of the most commonly taught things is leaven is symbolic of sin, right? That's very commonly taught, and it is. It is. That's part of what they meant by a little leaven leavens the whole dough, whole lump. Is sin kind of permeates, and the leaven of the Pharisees. That, like you say, that's a bad thing. But I think it's got other symbolic meaning too. Were you going to say something about that, Margaret?
Well, to his comment, I was going to say that during Shavuot, it requires leavened bread. And so, it's used, the leavened bread is also used as a wave offering.
Yes.
To represent the harvest, another harvest.
I think you hit the nail on the head, when you said in here, it's speaking of haste. We're going to have to leave in a hurry. That's why you have your your cloak and your belt and your sandals on is because we're going to leave. You know, we haven't got time to spend 3 or 4 days preparing. We're going to leave, and so we don't have time to let the bread rise. So that's why it's unleavened. I can buy that. But it struck me today that another thing about, you know, you clean out all the leaven, and that's kind of like new beginnings, right? Because leaven, the thing about leaven is it hangs around and flavors, if you will, or does what it does to stuff that goes on. You know, the way you make bread typically, right, is you keep part of the old dough around so that you can stick it in the fresh dough and have it leaven that. They remember all that stuff. That's sourdough. Sourdough is that way, right? So whenever you eat unleavened bread, you're basically saying, okay, I'm starting all over. This is a new beginning. You know, we're going to start from scratch now. I don't know. Maybe that doesn't fit, but it kind of strikes me it does.
Yeah, usually, well, back then, the leaven was a piece of sourdough
Yeah.
that went sour. It had time to ferment.
Uh-huh.
And whereas if you just knead the dough, add water to it, and cook it quickly, because once you let it sit a few minutes, it starts the fermentation.
Yep.
I think also, as far as unleavened, it does puff up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, leaven puffs up.
It just makes it's got a different texture to it rather than just the bread in its simplest form.
Yep. And that serves to set this holiday apart, right? Yep. That's why they call it the Feast of Unleavened Bread.
Did you say the unleavened is in its simplest form? Yeah. So it's interesting because what I was going to add to what you were saying is, you've heard me say before that barley, in comparison to wheat, is the barley can be eaten as it is, as it showed Yeshua, and when they came over across the land, they crossed over the Jordan, and they were eating the barley right off the
stalks.
Stalks.
Yeah.
Whereas wheat's got to be, ground. It's got to be ground. It's got to be all these things done to it before it can be used. Well, leaven and unleavened is the same way. The unleavened can be used as it is. Nothing needs to be done to it. But the leavening, it's got to have things done to it before it can reach that spot of. So, like Christ, he doesn't need anything. He's the unleavened bread. He's the barley. But we, the wheat and the leavened bread, we've got to have things done to us to reach the stage of being ready.
That kind of fits, yeah.
I think too, there's an emphasis during unleavened bread, and I know a lot of people, they focus so much on, you got to remove the leaven, you got to remove the leaven. Yeah, you got to remove the leaven, but you also have to eat unleavened bread. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of times, I think when the way I've seen people keep unleavened bread, they add all kinds of stuff to make it foam up. Like they add egg, they beat the egg so that they can get a little bit of height to it.
Yeah.
And the purpose of eating unleavened bread is to eat it just as simple as it is.
Yeah. Yeah, I understand what you're saying.
And it can be, I don't know, to me unleavened bread is a wonderful thing because I cook unleavened bread very basically. And to me, unleavened bread, I add olive oil. And to me, that represents Yahweh's name. Mm-hmm. And when you're baking, or even just making a tortilla out of unleavened flour, you got salt, you got water, you got the flour, and the oil. Mm-hmm.
Pretty simple.
It kind of reminds me that the temple, Yahweh's temple, it had that showbread, and that must have been how it smelled. It's a wonderful smell.
Yeah, I'll give you that.
I've kept unleavened bread for so many years, and I just love the smell of unleavened bread.
Well, I think one of the things about unleavened bread that I've grown to really like about it is that it just means Passover. You know what I mean? I associate it with Passover. Not that I don't eat it other times if it's round or whatever, but unleavened bread just goes with Passover. And I think that's a lot of what God intended. It's just, we'll talk, now's probably a good time. Why is it important to have holidays. Holidays, of course, is a I don't know, a change of the word holy day, right? That's what holiday is. It's just holy day. Holy means set apart, right? So why does God, or for matter of fact, any of these other counterfeit religions, why do they have holy days? Why do they have holidays? What are the purpose of holidays?
Well, I think as far as the outside the camp, really, or for lack of a better term
Okay.
in my mind, is that it is the enemy trying to counterfeit what God wants to put in place. And I think the reason why holidays are important is that I think one of the differentiations between a slave, if you will, and a free man is time off,
Yeah.
That's one of the differentiations.
Okay, that's a good one. That's fine. I guess one of the things you were kind of hinting at, and I've kind of grown to believe this too, these, to me, and there's no real strong foundation for this, but I like to believe that God invented holidays, and all these others have been, like you say, copies. They're counterfeits. Yeah, they co-opted them. And there's plenty of examples of that, really, for sure. So, but let's say that. So let's say God invented them. And you're right about a lot. What were some of the purposes? Certainly, we're free men, and so we ought to be able to have a day off. As a matter of fact, I've often thought, why should keeping Shabbat be such a pain? Who wouldn't want a day off, right? That ought to be easy. And I think he intends it to be. But so what's another reason for having holidays? There's several reasons. There's not just one reason, but there's several. Yeah.
Yeah, to memorialize, to
Yes,
remember.
that's what it says right there, to memorialize, right? Okay. And the purpose of memorializing is so that
Verse 14.
future generations can remember, right? See, that's one of the things that's really neat about this, is this was before the day of public schools and textbooks and Encyclopedia Britannica or the internet, So most people learn stuff by word of mouth, and most people learn stuff from their family, from their parents. And so he says, we're to do this every year. So every year, and he just really kind of gets it point blank. He says, when your children ask you, what is this we're doing? This is what you tell them. And so by doing that, it perpetuates this story. And I think it's truly amazing. This event we're reading about here arguably happened about 3,500 years ago. 3,500 years ago. And you could make a strong case for the fact that somebody, somewhere on earth celebrated Passover every year of those 3,500 years. It's probably the longest continuously celebrated holy day there ever was. I think that's pretty cool. And so it's done exactly what God intended it to do. It's kept this story alive. It's memorialized it. I think that's really great. Then when you go off and look at the other things it does, like predict the future, foreshadow coming events, all kinds of other stuff. But man, these holidays have got to be a really great creation. I'd have never thought of it, right?
So so it helps to tie in the past, and it links to the future on so the community has a continuum to look back on and look forward to.
Exactly. As a matter of fact, what I tell people about these feast days is that they do two things. They remember something that happened in the past, and they point to something that's going to happen in the future. And as good Christians, we all know how Passover pre-shadows the coming of Messiah, right? We even know how many of you know the things that Shavuot or Pentecost is the one that sits by itself. There's 3 in the spring, then there's Pentecost, and then there's 3 in the fall. So Pentecost sits by itself. We will learn this, and I'm cheating by doing this, but what does it commemorate? What does it memorialize? Do you know? It was the giving of the Torah. That's what it memorializes. What does it prefigure? And by the way, it doesn't have to be just one thing. There's probably a lot of other things it memorializes too, but that's probably the main one. What's the main thing it predicts?
Prefigures the Spirit being given freely to all men.
In Acts chapter 2. Yep, that's exactly right. So we live in a unique time because the guys back here, they were doing this, well, I don't know why we're putting blood on the doorpost, but okay, we'll go through all this. And they didn't understand that it was to memorialize, let alone that it was to predict the coming of the Messiah. But we're way out here 3,500 years later, we can look back and say, wow, that was really cool. And we can see that about the spring feast. We can see that about Shavuot. But the fall feast haven't occurred yet, in my opinion. We still got Feast of Trumpets, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot to be fulfilled. Yep.
Oh, I thought it was interesting on Shabbat. I think it was John who mentioned that the first generation of the Israelites, when they came out of Egypt, he said they couldn't get the Egypt out of them because all this stuff was happening. They see it happening. And it wasn't very long when they were out in the desert. It's like they forgot everything.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we'll say that over and over, especially in the book of Numbers. What are these guys? They just saw all of this stuff. How on earth could they say, oh, I wish we were back in Egypt with the leeks and the onions or whatever? I mean, you have to be nuts to do that. But on the other hand, we weren't there, so we shouldn't pass the judgment. Anyway, I'm sorry I got off on the feast days, but they're really, really cool. And the point is regardless of what it looks like from our standpoint, or even from their standpoint, the things that it's trying to do, it's done a lot of them. I mean, we're just amazed that we're privileged that we can see a lot of them. I mean, like I say, we may not know the full meaning of eating unleavened bread for a week. I got to tell you, quite frankly, I don't see it completely, but I'm sure I will. But some of the stuff that we have talked about, we can really see it. And it really is interesting that like I say, they're still doing Passover now. Right? We are still doing Passover now. It says in verse 24, obey these instructions as a lasting ordinance for you and your descendants. So what happened then is at midnight, all the people that were in there eating their roast lamb with their robes tucked in their belts with their sandals on, ready to go, we're listening to all these wailings, right? It says wails of, because people were dying. Firstborn was dying. Any other thoughts about any of that stuff before we go on? Let me make sure there's all kinds of stuff I probably didn't talk about. Oh, I know one final thing go ahead. You first.
I just noticed in 23 where it said the Lord will pass through to smite the Egyptians. We mentioned that probably some Israelites didn't put on, but that wasn't God's intent. He intended just the Egyptians to be taken.
Yes.
I like that.
Yes.
Another thing when you're reading in this about the awe, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And I'm also thinking about the word Passover that has replaced Pesach. Pesach, to me now, as we've studied it tonight, incorporates the awe of the whole, not just the passing over.
Yeah.
And when we equate this or call this the Passover feast, we cheat ourselves from a lot of the awe of the whole event.
That's a fair point. Yep.
And the one other thing is you mentioned that why do we say a lamb? Possibly because of the connotation that it later Yeshua was the Lamb of God.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Fair. That's good.
I think to add to a comment, Yeshua as the Passover, the real Passover.
Yeah.
There is just so much that his life just, it brings to us. He brings the commandments. He brings kindness. He brings healing. He brings everything. The perfection. He had such a master of words and talking and the healing and trying to explain things in parables. That's awe-inspiring.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I remember, if you follow the logic, this has always kind of baffled me, but made me feel good at the same time. Yeshua says he's the Word. The Gospel of John talks about the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, right? But we know that this is the Word. Specifically, the Torah is the Word. So you have Yeshua, this guy, if you will, being the same thing as the Torah. And you ask yourself, well, how can that be? But it makes sense, really. It's almost like the Torah is the written word, and if we can study it and understand it, it tells us how we're to live our life and how God feels about us and how he wants us to relate to him and behave. But Yeshua is the experiential Torah. He's the demo. He showed us what it looks like. So the two really are the same thing. But boy, it's hard to wrap your mind around that. But I'm convinced that they're all trying to teach the same lesson. Not all, they're both trying to teach us the same things. Do you think? Yeah.
Look.
Okay, let's go on, and this is fun. I'm having a good time. Does somebody want to read from verse 31 through 42 in chapter 12? Oh, yeah, I didn't get to this part yet. I'll read it. I haven't had my turn yet, so I'll do that. But I have to get I lost my glasses. Well, we'll just work on it here. Starting with 31. During the night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "Up, leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go, worship Yahweh as you have requested. Take your flocks and herds as you have said, and go, and also bless me." The Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the country, for otherwise, they said, we will all die. So the people took their dough before the yeast was added and carried it on their shoulders in kneading troughs wrapped in clothing. The Israelites did as Moses instructed and asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and clothing. Yahweh had made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, and they gave them what they asked for, and so they plundered the Egyptians. The Israelites journeyed from Ramesses to Sukkoth. There was about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. Many other people went with them, as well as large droves of livestock, both flocks and herds. With the dough they had brought from Egypt, they baked cakes of unleavened bread. The dough was without yeast because they had been driven out of Egypt and did not have time to prepare food for themselves. Now the length of time the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years. And at the end of 430 years, to the very day, all Yahweh's divisions left Egypt. Because Yahweh kept vigil that night to bring them out of Egypt, and on this night all the Israelites are to keep vigil to honor the Lord for the generations to come. So I thought we'd maybe get this far. This is a map. There's nothing, let's see. There are at least 3 different ideas about the paths that the Israelites took when they left Egypt. But one of the things we know they didn't do, we haven't quite gotten there yet, but I'm going to talk about it anyway. Goshen's over there at the left end of that red line, says Goshen. They could have taken this pale yellow line called the way of the land of the Philistines. The Philistines lived up there to on the southeast corner of the Mediterranean Sea. And that would have been the obvious way to get to Israel, is go up to the sea coast and just, you couldn't get lost that way. So, but God didn't want them to go that way. He sent them the other way. He sent them down south. And it says here they stopped in Sukkoth, I think, somewhere. But some people, their traditional model has them coming down through the wilderness of the Red Sea to Sinai. They have Sinai down here in the middle of the Sinai Peninsula. I think there is definitely a mountain over in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is just to the east of the Gulf of Aqaba there. There's definitely a mountain over there called Jebel el Lawz, which is otherwise It's Mount Sinai is what it is. And so this particular map is done by a group of people that have convinced themselves and make a very strong argument for this red path, okay? And then there's another one that I've read that I thought was pretty good too, that shows them coming down to the tip of the Sinai Peninsula and crossing right there at the south end of the Gulf of Aqaba. In any case, we'll talk more about this. The Mount Sinai is more than likely in the Arabian Peninsula and not in the Sinai Peninsula. But we'll get there. Anyway, I'm always going ahead. Any thoughts about any of that stuff we just talked about? Oh, the 430 years. I get confused about the 430 years.
430?
Beg your pardon? Yeah, go for
I
it.
kind of see the 430 as being from the promise to
Abraham.
Abraham
I do
that Mark
too.
was talking about last Shabbat.
Yep, I do too. I do too.
So, because, yeah, if you add up the years, it just doesn't add up.
Yeah.
430 years
Yeah.
in captivity.
Yep, I agree.
But actually, this Bible I have, it shows a map similar to that, Jebel El Laz, although I think it shows it a little further north. I don't know where it's at, but
That probably does.
that kind of makes the most sense because I think even Paul mentions Mount Sinai being in Arabia.
It is, yep.
So,
Yeah, Paul at one point in his writing says, I went to Mount Sinai in Arabia.
Could it be 430 years from Genesis 16 or 17 going forward?
Yep, that's what Mike and I
Yeah.
Yeah, when he made the covenant, when God made the covenant with Abraham, that time, or like you say, he walked through the parts of the animals, and that's when he told him, 430 years will pass, and your descendants will live in a foreign land, blah, blah, blah. I think it was 430 years from then. That adds up right, or at least close to right. But there aren't enough generations for them to be 430 years in Egypt, and you can follow, Jacob had Levi, who had, was it somebody else that had Amram, that had Moses, and there just aren't enough generations to go 430 years. So anyway. Is there something else I want to talk about? Probably not. So let's finish the chapter. Does somebody want to read from 43 to the end of chapter 12? It's short. 43 to the end of chapter 12. It's only, 8 verses. And they're short ones.
And the Lord said unto Moses and Aaron, This is the ordinance of the Passover. Thou shalt no stranger eat thereof, but every man's servant that is bought for money, that thou hast circumcised him, then shall he eat thereof. A foreigner and a hired servant shall not eat thereof. In one house shall it be eaten. Thou shalt not carry forth aught of the flesh abroad out of the house, neither shall ye break a bone thereof. All the congregation of Israel shall keep it. And when a stranger shall sojourn with thee, and will keep the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised, and then let him come near and keep it. And he shall be as one that is born in the land. For no uncircumcised person shall eat thereof. One law shall be for him that is homeborn, and unto the stranger that sojourneth among you. Thus did all the children of Israel, as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron, so did they. And it came to pass the selfsame day that the Lord did bring the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt by their armies.
Great. Now, there's some interesting kind of controversial things to talk about there. The main thing being, it says no foreigner may eat it. Any slave you've bought may eat of it after you have circumcised him. But a temporary resident or a hired worker may not eat of it. Must be eaten inside one house, not taken outside. In other words, this is not a picnic, right? Do not break any of the bones in the lamb. The whole community must celebrate it. So it's not optional. It's not like, well, I don't think I'll do it this year. An alien living among you who wants to celebrate the Passover must have all his males in his house circumcised, and then he may take part, like one born in the land. So when you read all of that, aside from, getting into the nits of who can and who can't, what's the main point of the restrictions about who can celebrate Passover?
That would be to differentiate the people outside the camp versus people inside the camp.
Okay, that's a fair way of putting it. What I would have said is it's basically people who have joined into the covenant versus people who have not.
Yeah,
Go
so
ahead.
even an Egyptian men who were circumcised had gone that far would be showing themselves, they'd be definitely, circumcision is a very vulnerable thing.
Yeah, especially as an adult. So what you'd think, I guess the way I would put it is this way. If someone had understood enough about the Israelite God, our God, to understand that circumcision is the sign of willing participation in the covenant, then that person, as far as God's concerned, he's in, because he's made the commitment. And it's not been a small commitment, right? He said, I'll do this. I want to be, like Ruth says, I want your people to be my people and your God to be my God. And one of the things that points out that I feel really strongly about is God is real big on adoption. You can adopt in. You have to know what you're doing. You can't do it, you can't do it under duress. You can't do it under false pretenses. But if you want to participate in the covenant, you are welcome to participate in the covenant. And that's the main thing I get. Yeah.
And that's the circumcision of the heart first.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's why I say it needs to mean what it's supposed to mean.
Something you want to do, the heart circumcised to want to do it, just like Abram was heart first before flesh, and then comes the flesh. And you mentioned, Greg, that it was no small thing. Well, in our portion this week, Abraham's doing it at 99.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, it's interesting that it's our portion this week in the Torah, and here we are talking about it in Tuesday study. Did the Egyptians and the Midianites and all of that came out with them, did they get circumcised?
Well, theoretically, yes, probably not. But, the thing is it says here they were supposed to be.
Yep.
Yeah.
I say they did.
Okay.
That's my...
Yeah.
You would look pretty... you want to be part of... you've already seen this God, and if you're coming with him, you're all in.
Oh, yeah.
You're like, hey...
Yeah.
Well, I wouldn't want to be left out of anything. I want to be part of the family.
Yep.
I want to be part of the whole thing. And God's made the provision very clear here that you can be.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I've got something very, very... I'm not going to say it tonight, but I've got something very, very interesting, very, very prophetic about this whole circumcision thing.
Okay. Anyway, I think go ahead, Margaret.
Yeah, I think the night of Passover observance is a very serious thing. I think a lot of the Christian churches just kind of take it in as, it's a nice thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just a nice thing to do. You got to be all in, like
Mark says.
It's a serious thing.
Yeah. That's a very good point,
Yeah.
Margaret.
And it's forever, and you just don't do it halfway. You got to be all in the covenant. You got to be observing. You got to.
Yeah.
I think it's a night to be very much observed. The word to be much observed is shumir. It's a night watch, and the root comes from shamar.
Okay.
It means to watch, to observe, to actually do something.
Yeah.
And I would go and say that you would have to be all in with a feast. You would have to be all in with all of Torah.
Yeah. Well, the thing about it is, in my experience, is once you kind of make that decision, then it's a lifelong process. And the more you're in it, the more you realize that this is the way it's supposed to be. This is what God wants. He wants your total commitment. And you can, for me anyway, you can sit around and think you're totally committed. But as years go by, you find out, well, what I thought was total commitment before isn't quite the same thing as I understand total commitment to be now. Yeah. Yeah. Mark?
What if, this just came to me while we were talking here. What if the doorpost was cedar?
It probably was. Why?
What was used to put the blood on the doorposts?
Hyssop.
What's used in all of the purification and sanctification rites for the leper and the red heifer?
Cedar and hyssop, both, aren't they?
That would be awesome if it was a cedar. And I mean, Solomon is good wood because Solomon built, God's house was cedar. So that would be, I never thought of it until tonight, but that would be amazing if the hyssop was used to put it on that cedar. Mm-hmm. And of course, blood is scarlet red. And so here we've got the three things that are, I don't know, to me, it's just amazing.
Yep. That's good.
So what you're saying is these aren't just Jewish holidays?
Well, it's not what he describes, Yeah.
That's my best John imitation, by the way.
That was our homage to John.
Anyways, moving on. In verse 46, I find it interesting that it says, nor are you to break any bone of it, which points to the Messiah when he was crucified.
Yep.
It says they will not break any of his bones.
And they didn't.
And I think that's written somewhere else, but this is probably the first time that was prophesied.
Yeah, I agree. I'm sure you're right. Well, see, we only got 5 minutes left. But I think, I don't know. Why don't you let me read the first part of chapter 13, and then we'll see where it leads. If it's kind of like, okay, fine, then we can be done with it. But if it's, we need to talk about that a little more, we can do it next week. So let me read it, and we'll see how it goes. So I'm going to read chapter 13. My little heading here says, consecration of the firstborn. So it says, Yahweh said to Moses, consecrate to me every firstborn male. The first offspring of every womb among the Israelites belongs to me, whether man or animal. Then Moshe said to the people, commemorate this day, the day that you came out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery, because Yahweh brought you out with a mighty hand Eat nothing containing yeast. Today, in the month of Abib, you are leaving. When Yahweh brings you into the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, the land he swore to your forefathers to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, you are to observe this ceremony in this month. For 7 days, eat bread made without yeast, and on the seventh day, hold a festival to Yahweh. Eat unleavened bread during those 7 days. Nothing with yeast in it is to be seen among you, nor shall any yeast be seen anywhere within your borders. On that day, tell your son, I do this because of what Yahweh did for me when I came out of Egypt. This observance will be for you like a sign on your hand and a reminder on your forehead that the law of Yahweh is to be on your lips. For Yahweh brought you out of Egypt with his mighty hand. You must keep this ordinance at the appointed time, year after year. After Yahweh brings you into the land of Canaanites and gives it to you, as he promised on oath to you and your forefathers, you are to give over to Yahweh the first offspring of every womb. All the firstborn males of your livestock belong to Yahweh. Redeem with a lamb every firstborn donkey. But if you do not redeem it, break its neck. Redeem every firstborn among your sons. In days to come, when your son asks you, what does this mean? You say to him, with a mighty hand Yahweh brought us out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. When Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, Yahweh killed every firstborn in Egypt, both man and animal. And this is why I sacrifice to Yahweh the first male offspring of every womb and redeem each of my firstborn sons. And it will be like a sign on your hand and a symbol on your forehead that Yahweh brought us out of Egypt with his mighty hand. I'm going to stop there because that's the end of this portion. And also, that's a nice hunk to talk about. Now, we're essentially done. I suspect, if nothing else, we probably ought to talk about redemption. But I don't think that's something I want to start at 7:30. What are your thoughts? Any thoughts? Okay, I tell you what I propose. I propose that next week when we come back, probably read that again, and we'll talk about it. Because there's some things in there we need to understand. This is really probably one of the first places we get this really clear understanding of what redemption means. You know, because God's setting out some very basic little formula here. This is how it has to work. So we'll talk about that. And you can go off and see what you think about it. Are there any other final thoughts or comments or anything? Okay, I'm going to close in prayer, if that's okay. Father God, I thank you. I thank you for the evening. I really do thank you for this group of people that wanted to look at your Torah. I thank you for the exciting place we are with the Passover. And it was almost like the birth of the nation. And it's so great that you were involved at this point and in this way. Help us to learn all that it has for us. Help us to understand these things in light of the fact that we're living 3,500 years later, and we can see what you're doing. Father God, bless us. Bless us as we look at your word, and bless us as we interact with each other, and bless us as we go through our everyday lives. Keep us safe until we meet together Shabbat and next Tuesday. In Yahushua's name, amen. Thanks. I had a good time tonight, so I appreciate it. And thank you.